Hello, welcome to week 13. Today we're going to talk about functional communication training. We've talked about this actually several times throughout this semester. We've referred to it as differential reinforcement of an alternative behavior because that's really what functional communication is. It's an example of a DRA. We've also referred to it as a functional replacement behavior, which again, functional communication training is one example of how a functional replacement behavior is used. And we're going to talk about it again today because I think it's really important and a very, very practical type of intervention when used correctly, and one that is often very successful and really much easier to use, although some of these studies that you hear about sound so complicated. I wanted to help to sort of break a couple of them down, that they're not really that complicated in terms of theoretically what you need to do. So I'm a big advocate of DRAs or functional replacement behaviors. So of functional communication being one of those, again, just because they're so straightforward and easy. So let's start with the first study, which is really I would say, a classic study in the area of functional communication by Melissa Shirley, Awada, Sung Woo, Jody Malinsky, and Dorothy Lerman. And so they evaluated a critical piece of functional communication training, which is extinction of the target behavior. So you guys remember how this works. Functional communication training typically consists of, you start with a good functional assessment. Oftentimes it's a functional analysis. So, for example, so you have to know what is maintaining the target behavior. So let's say you're working with an individual in one of your settings that engages in disruptive behavior. So that's the target behavior. You do a nice, simple functional analysis, and you find out that it's maintained by, let's say, negative reinforcement. That is, escaping, avoiding undesired activities, let's say demands. So then you implement an intervention where those reinforcers, that is, being able to escape, are now contingent on a more socially acceptable behavior. So the steps are, you're doing a functional analysis, then you're following that with a training a functional communication response. Let's say it's going to be asking for a break, or if the person isn't verbal, give them a break card and handing you a break card, which means they get a break from the activity. And then you would reinforce that. Okay, so everybody clear on this strategy that you used for functional communication training. You determine what the function is. For in our example, it's negative reinforcement. You then teach a arbitrary response. In our example, that's handing you a break card, which then you terminate the demand for a short period of time. And And that's essentially functional communication training. You're teaching the individual a more socially acceptable way to get exactly the same reinforcer that was maintaining the maladaptive behavior. That's why I like this so much, because it is so simple and it's so powerful that you're not having to deal with arbitrary reinforcers. You're dealing with the actual reinforcer that is maintaining the behavior. All right. So the Shirley article points out that a critical variable in all of these functional communication studies is that reinforcement, in our case, that is negative reinforcement, for the target behavior is eliminated during functional communication training. So, in other words, when you teach the child this new behavior, which in our example is raising his hand. Oh no, I'm sorry, handing you the break card. That gets reinforced by termination of the demand. At the same time, you have to put the target behavior, the disruptive behavior, on extinction. That is, the disruptive behavior now never gets followed by escaping the demand. But the only thing that does get followed by escaping the demand is the um, functional communication response, which in this case is um, handing you the break card. Okay, so let's look at this more closely. So in their methods, they had 3 adults that they worked with who were all had very severe intellectual disabilities, and the target behavior was self-injurious behavior. They did the standard functional analyses. Let's just look at that. Pretty straightforward. As you can see for Rick, clearly Rick was maintained, his SIB was maintained by tangible materials. Same thing with Sue, the triangle, upside down triangle, tangible materials. And for John, the third participant, his was clearly maintained by demands. So the effects. So the other thing they did then is they looked at the effects of functional communication training with and without extinction, and of the target behavior, with and without extinction of the targeted behavior. And they used a multiple baseline and a reversal design. So let's look at that. So here's the target behaviors, the SIB, for all 3 individuals, Rick, Sue, and John. And this is baseline in a regular functional assessment. So for Rick, for example, if I recall, he was, let's see, his tangible was getting access to his shirt. So during the baseline condition, every time he engaged in self-injurious behavior, he got access to his shirt. For Sue, she had, hers was access to a preferred game. So in baseline, every time she engaged in self-injurious behavior, they would give her access to her game. And for John, remember, it was negative reinforcement, so it was demands. And so during baseline, he was able to escape or avoid a demand, which is a natural kind of thing. The demand is going to be at least postponed. um, when he engaged in self-injurious behavior. All right, so then the first phase is just functional communication training. So what does that mean? Well, that means they taught them a arbitrary response. So for Rick, it was clasping his hands together. For Sue, it was clapping her hands. And for John, I think it was raising his hand. That all of those would produce the same reinforcer that they were getting for SIB. So for Rick, for example, when he would clasp his hands together, he would get access to his shirt. He'd also get access to his shirt, though, because this was not on extinction, if he engaged in SIB. And you can see for all three individuals, just having functional communication in place, that is, just by just reinforcing the appropriate behavior, if you were still reinforcing the inappropriate behavior, resulted in no substantial decrease in the targeted behaviors. And well, let's move on. However, when you added extinction, that is extinction for the target behavior. So back to Rick's case again, now if he engaged in self-injurious behavior, he did not get his shirt. The only way he was getting his shirt in this condition, FCT plus extinction, was by engaging in the arbitrary behavior, which was, I believe, clasping his hands. And we see a couple of interesting things. One, a huge extinction burst, which you would expect, because he's no longer getting reinforced, which apparently he had been for a long, long time, not just in this study, for his SIB by getting what he wanted back. So now that wasn't working, and so now he started engaging in the functional communication response, and with time, we see basically the SIB basically went away. And we see exactly the same pattern with Sue. A big extinction burst, and then hers is just more gradually until finally she's not engaging in the target behavior at all. And John, basically the same, a few high points here coming down, but basically once extinction was put in place, and remember for John that was raising his hand, now when he engaged in SIB he was not allowed to escape from the demands during this condition because it's extinction. But he could escape if he raised his hand, and he would then get a break. And you see exactly the same pattern. Little bit of extinction bursts, not a typical extinction burst pattern, at least not with these 2 points, but eventually came down to zero. Interestingly, if this graph is looking at the responses, the functional communication response, and if you look at the functional communication response, you see exactly the same pattern. Of course, there was none in baseline. When Justin when you started the functional communication training, they really didn't engage in the behavior much, and certainly not independently. That's the closed circles. Zero. Well, almost zero. Sue did it a couple of times. John did it a couple of times also. But for the most part, it was only prompted. They were not consistently engaging independently in the functional communication response, which is what you'd want them to do to get reinforced, although they did get reinforced if they engaged in it after prompting also. However, when we introduced extinction, exactly the same thing. We see an increase in independent use of the functional communication response for Rick clasping his hands together. And recall that corresponds with this decrease in the SIB, or the targeted behavior, and the same pattern really with everyone. Sue, and with John, not quite as dramatic, but still an increase in the target behavior. Recall for John, that's raising his hand so that he could escape, briefly escape a demand, or get a break from a demand. All right. So let's just review that. So basically, there was no decrease in SIB for any of the participants when functional communication training was implemented without extinction. So that was this first phase right here. Similarly, no participant acquired the response, that arbitrary response, also referred to as the functional communication response, that was intended to serve as a replacement for the SIB when the target behavior was also reinforced. However, when SIB was placed on extinction, all participants showed increases in the alternative behaviors and decreases in SIB. All right, then there's one final part of this study which I think is very cool, and that's really where I think there's a lot of practical applications in you guys being able to use this kind of procedure, functional communication training. And that is, they wondered what happens, all right, once, so we know you're not going to likely acquire the, have beneficial effects of functional communication training unless you also put the target behavior on extinction. The problem is, great, that's great to know. The problem is, as we've talked about before, the reality of the situation is, sure, you could have perfect extinction in a study like this, where you've got, graduate students functioning as the therapists and doing these sessions for brief sessions. But what about in a real environment? What about, in a classroom setting, for example, all day? Or if you work in a group home, in the group home in the evenings all night long? Or if you're working in someone's home, how about in their home 24/7? Ensuring extinction of the target behavior 100% of the time is going to be really tough. So one of the things they looked at that I think was very cool about this study is they looked at, all right, once we've demonstrated that functional communication is effective, once we have the individual engaging in the target, engaging in the functional communication response, the arbitrary response that we want. So Rick clasping his hands, or Sue clapping her hands, or John raising his hand. Once we have that going, which is here, and it's being reinforced, then can we go back to a situation where the individual would be reinforced for either the target behavior, so in these guys' cases, SIB, and the new behavior. So back to just regular FCT, and the answer is an encouraging yes for Rick. So look at this. Even though now, once it was down, we see if we go back to just FCT, that is, he's being reinforced when he engages in the target, when he engages in the alternative behavior, socially acceptable alternative behavior, but he's also being reinforced when he engages in SIB, but yet we see almost no SIB, one little point up here. We see the same thing for John. It took a little longer John is just a little slower getting this, but this is much different than what we had back here. So we found the same thing with John. That is, we didn't need the extinction to go on forever. Sue, on the other hand, unfortunately, once we got rid of extinction, she went back to using the SIB in order to get access to her favorite games, like she did before. Now, not quite as high, but too high, and certainly higher than what is acceptable given the fact this is SIB. So for Sue, they did have to put a functional communication training and extinction back in place to bring it back down. Now, and of course, we see basically a very similar pattern when we look at the alternative behaviors or the functional communication response. We see for Rick, the functional communication response didn't change. Actually, even for Sue, the functional communication response sort of continued. Maybe it dropped down a little bit or a few points below, but for the most part, the functional communication response. So she was still getting reinforced for using this, but she was also doing SIB. And for John, we see the same thing. Basically, the functional communication response was not disrupted when we moved back to just an FCT and started reinforcing the target behavior again. I think that's important from a practical point of view, as important implications, because that tells us that if you were going to try to implement this in a clinical setting, you really have to ensure the integrity of the program. That is, that you've got FCT and extinction initially. But then once that functional communication response is established, once the target behavior is really low, then, you probably still tell people don't reinforce it, but if they do periodically, the chances are that it is not going to disrupt functional communication. All right, let's go back and look at this. So finally, in interpreting the results, once SIB was decreased and the alternative behavior was consistently occurring, the re-exposure to reinforcement of the SIB did not disrupt signing, so that's the alternative behavior, or lead to an increase in SIB in 2 of the 3 participants. And for those of you who are classic rock aficionados, you know, of course, that Meatloaf said 2 out of 3 ain't bad, and I agree with him. And for those of you who aren't classic rock aficionados and don't know what I'm talking about, this just falls in the category of another stupid joke of mine. But the point is, 2 out of 3 is actually encouraging that we didn't need to continue with perfect extinction of the target behavior forever. And that's where I think the important implications for practical implications of this procedure are. Okay. So, conclusions. Extinction of the target behavior, in this case it was SIB, is critical to functional communication being effective, at least at the beginning of establishing the functional communication response. Also, these results are important because extinction of target behaviors may not always be practical or possible for extended periods of time. So what are the implications for clinical practice? I sort of talked about them, but I'm going to leave that for you, and that's going to be one of your assignment questions. In the assignment is, what are the implications of clinical practice of this Shirley study? All right. So hopefully you're clear. I think this is an important study to understand. The take-home points for this one are extinction, at least initially, is critical. Extinction of that target behavior is critical early on when you're trying to establish functional communication training, And really moving forward, um, yeah, you would want to make sure you're not going to implement it unless you could be pretty sure that you can maintain extinction of that target behavior. Um, the second study I wanted you to look at is this Furman article, which I just saw. It just came out in JABA in 2018. Um, and it's by the same group, um, Wayne Fisher's group, and he's the one who is doing the video on functional communication training. His group has done a lot of functional communication kind of work over the last many years. And I just wanted to touch on again some practical aspects. Now, this, like a lot of his work, can get pretty thick in terms of the methods. And I want you to sort of cut through those and look at, and I want to highlight for you what I think are some of the more practical aspects of this particular article, which can be difficult to read, but you've got to learn how to read them so that you can pull out what the practical issues are. Again, not that you're not going to evaluate these articles, but that's a different task. How do you read through some of these JABA articles and sort of glean, okay, how much more do I need to know about this, and what are the main points? Is this something that could be practical or useful in my current clinical setting? All right, so this article kind of moves on to the next practical question. So Shirley talked about extinction and how important extinction of the target behavior is, at least initially. Okay, well, this article, and there were a lot in between Shirley and this one that talked about this also, addresses a second practical issue. And Fisher talks about several others also in the video, but which is, okay, let's go back to our example of an individual who engages in disruptive behavior. And we do a functional analysis, and we see it's maintained by negative reinforcement. That is escape or avoidance of a task that she doesn't like. And we teach her to raise her hand in order to escape, and whenever she engages in disruptive behaviors, we don't allow her to escape. Okay, functional communication training. Great. Except we can't live with the fact that now she's learned, oh great, all I have to do is raise my hand and you will allow me to escape every demand that you place on me 100% of the time. Of course, that's the way we start to establish the behavior, but that's got to be thinned, and that's the language that Fisher uses, is the thinning of that reinforcement schedule. Obviously, that is not very useful. No, same thing with someone who you teach to say, for example, help me for an attention-motivated maladaptive behavior. You don't want a person who is very attention-motivated, who is going to be saying, help me, help me, help me, help me, 50 times a minute or an hour. So you have to thin that reinforcement schedule in order to make this practical. You need to get it to a point that you could live with it, so that, sure, once in a while, Sue can escape situations that demands. but she can't escape every demand. Or that Bill can get attention when he really needs it, but we can't reinforce it 100% of the time. So how do we get there? And that's really what this article sort of summarizes a lot of the literature on this, and looks at a method of a way that you can do it. And the technique that they're using, I personally have never used, but it looks kind of cool to me. And I think I will try to work it in sometime, see how it works for me. So the background is when functional communication training is initiated, the functional communication response, the FCR, that is the arbitrary behavior, is typically reinforced on a continuous reinforcement schedule. So that's what I just said. One of the challenges is the thinning of that schedule. Now, Fisher uses a lot of terminology that you guys really need to know for your test, but as behavior analysts, more importantly, these are not these are not phrases, language that you guys use in your practical settings. I know, it's back to Cooper. You can look all these up in the glossary of Cooper, but one of the ways that Fisher, or in this case Furman, actually say that you could thin that reinforcement schedule of the functional communication response is by using multiple schedules. So what does that mean? So I'll remind you, although you could go back to Cooper and look up multiple schedules because you did review that in 509. And a multiple schedule are really alternating schedules that are going to be going on, one then the other. They could be randomly alternating. And they're signaled. So the examples that Furman used is that, all right, one way that we could sort of thin out the schedule of reinforcement is that we teach the individual that when I'm wearing a yellow bracelet, that you when you engage in the functional communication response, let's say handing me a break card, that I will in fact give you a break. However, when I'm wearing a green bracelet or wristband, that then when you engage in the functional communication response, it isn't going to be reinforced. And then gradually we thin it out where we increase the amount of time that you're in the one multiple schedule, which the terminology that Furman uses is S delta. I can't do an S delta on the computer. I don't know how to do it, but that's an S with that little triangle that you see. That signals the absence of reinforcement, and SD, which of course you know, discriminative stimulus, that signals the availability of reinforcement. Okay, you with me? If you're not, go back and play this again, and or look at Cooper and look at multiple schedules. But one way to do thinning, to accomplish thinning of the schedule, is use multiple schedules. That is signaled times when you're saying, yes, engage in that functional communication response and I'm going to reinforce you, but other times you're not going to get reinforced. So, and then gradually increase the amount of times under S delta, which is not being reinforced. SD is when you are being reinforced. That's basically the mechanism. That is basically the terminology that these articles use. Now, where Furman's looking at, which I think is kind of cool, is one way that you could extend the X delta condition is by providing competing activities during the thinning process. So yeah, that makes sense. During that time, when now, of course, we have the target behavior under extinction, because we knew that from 1997 with Shirley, is one way is, oh, can we put some competing activities in there? And so people have tried various and sundry things, and some of them have worked and some of them haven't, like a lot of extra attention, or playing with tangible items or access to tangible items, or doing problems, having tasks, and having a person, working on numbers or puzzles or doing certain kinds of tasks as competing activities during the S delta, that signal time of the multiple schedule, when the functional communication response is not going to be reinforced any longer. Okay? All right. So their purpose was to provide a method to evaluate the effects of various competing activities for use when thinning reinforcement availability for a functional communication response. So as I mentioned, their method section can get a little hairy, but let's basically cut through it in terms of the practicalities. They used 2 children and their target behavior was disruptive behavior. Both of these kids had functional analyses prior to this study, and for both of them, access to an iPad and escape from demands is what maintained their disruptive behavior, destructive behavior. And although there were some specific differences, I don't want to get into them for this study. I just want to focus on the practical aspects of it. As I mentioned, basically it was the thinning of the functional communication response for both boys involved a multiple schedule of reinforcement where one condition, for example, a yellow wristband, signaled that the functional communication response would be reinforced, and another condition, a green wristband, signaled the absence of reinforcement. Okay? Here's the results. And this baseline condition is where the maladaptive behavior, destruction, or disruption, whatever it was, is being a destruction, is being reinforced with access to attention. And then this is where they're starting to try to thin it out. And the dark circle is just during that S delta condition. That is when the reinforcement isn't available. And then this just means they're starting to thin it out. The point is they looked at 2 things with Jacob. This was one of the 2 participants. And one was, well, how about if we put in attention? And during that period of time, the S delta time, when he doesn't have access to the reinforcer anymore, that we are going to just provide attention. And sure enough, that's the closed squares. You see it continues to be very low. And that was better than when they did what they're calling a chained functional communication training, which was just a series of activities, problems that he had to do. And if he finished one, then he had access to the next one, which then ultimately got him access to his reinforcers. That seemed to ultimately be better than doing nothing during the interim, but it wasn't, at least initially, had more problems. And then they reversed, and again, you could see where the um, providing attention during that S delta time was the most effective competing behavior. And essentially, we see the same thing for the other individual, which was Alan. Let's just jump right over to the competing activities. Now, Alan, again, compared attention, which is the open square, and the circle, which for him were access to tangible things. And we see, again, comparing it to the dark circle, well, some of the tangibles actually made it worse at some point. But if you look at the open squares, for the most part, they're down below the dark ones. And that's more obvious after they did the reversal and went back again and really just compared the multiple to the attention, that you could see that with competing activities of attention, that the amount of disruptive behavior was greatly reduced. Okay, so conclusions were that for both boys, providing competing activities during periods without reinforcement of the functional communication response effectively reduced disruptive behavior. So again, reinforcing this literature that's been out there, that if you put in some competing activities during periods without reinforcement, that that can help move along the thinning process without getting a lot of target behaviors occurring. And for both of the boys, Jacob and Alan, attention resulted in the lowest levels of destructive behavior. So that's really all I wanted to cover for these two articles. Of course, for this week, you need to read both of these articles. Please read them carefully. And again, I think, getting practice, particularly with the Furman article, of reading some of these articles and sort of pulling out what the major points are, the things that could be useful to clinical issues that you have. And then also make sure you watch the Wayne Fisher video on functional communication training. As I mentioned, he has done quite a bit of work in this area, and it's quite comprehensive. All right, if you have any questions about these articles, functional communication training, write them down. Don't forget to do the assignment this week. Write down the questions, and we will talk about them next week. And I will see you guys next week. Have a good week. Bye.